Thank you very much for the warm welcome to Berlin. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share some of my recent work looking at neural signatures of urgency in human perceptual decision making. So just to give you a brief outline of what I'll be talking about, I'll first have a look at the computational framework, the dominant computational framework for understanding perceptual decision making, and indeed the role of urgency in perceptual decision making. And then I'll move on to talking about a bit of my own work and hopefully convince you that we've been able to identify a neural signature of urgency in the human brain that is separate from motor preparation and also separate from evidence accumulation. So, although we might not often think about it, our moment-to-moment interactions with the sensory world actually consist of a series of quite deliberative decisions that we make based on sensory information. Some of these are quite easy, such as deciding whether or not a traffic light is green or red. And some of them are quite hard, as in the case where you're driving in very dense fog and trying to decide whether or not the road ahead is veering or continuing straight. And according to the dominant computational framework, which is the sequential sampling framework, we make these decisions not by relying on a single snapshot of sensory information, which can in fact be very noisy and unreliable, but instead by sampling multiple pieces of information or sensory evidence over time until we've accumulated a sufficient amount of information in order to commit to some decision. This is a very powerful framework, not only because it's been able to account for behavior across a wide range of perceptual tasks, but also because it corresponds quite nicely to what we observe in the brain, both in the non-human brain and in the human brain. For instance, when people are performing very simple perceptual tasks, such as the dot motion discrimination task, in which you monitor a patch of moving dots in order to try and discriminate what direction they're moving in. When we study the brain using electroencephalography, or EEG, we find that we can actually trace this evidence accumulation process directly, for instance, when we measure motor preparation signals. So if you're performing one of these tasks and you're required to indicate your choice by making a motor response, by tracing those response selective signals in the brain, we actually see these key dynamics of evidence accumulation. Specifically, we see a faster buildup in these signals when sensory evidence is stronger. Not only do we see this in response selective signals in the human brain, but we've also been able to isolate a centroparietal signal that represents evidence accumulation independent of motor preparation. So it exhibits the same characteristics of accumulating at a faster rate when sensory evidence is stronger, but it's distinct from motor preparation in that if you were to ask your participants to perform a task such as counting the number of times they observe dots moving consistently in one direction or another, even without that requirement to make a motor response, the centroparietal positivity will still trace the decision process. Sometimes when we're making these perceptual decisions, we are placed under constraints, the constraint of urgency, or in other words, speed pressure, for instance, in the classic speed accuracy trade-off paradigm. The sequential sampling framework can account for how we deal with these, with this speed pressure very simply via an adjustment in the decision policy or an adjustment in the decision bound. So we can simply lower the decision bound, thereby requiring less sensory evidence in order to commit to a decision. Another way, of course, that we could adapt to urgency in perceptual decision making is by collapsing the decision bound over time. So effectively, we require less sensory evidence over time in order to commit to a decision. This enables us to make faster decisions, and it can be very useful in situations where we have a strict time deadline or where the rewards that we're receiving for making our responses in these tasks diminish over time. Important to note is that there's been a lot of debate in the computational literature as to whether or not we use these collapsing bounds, and traditionally the decision bound has been seen as being something quite static. It's difficult, in fact, to arbitrate between the collapsing bound models and static bound models using computational modeling alone, because if you simply add a drift rate variability parameter to a static bound model, then you can actually capture the same behavioral dynamics that are readily captured by a collapsing bound model. However, if we turn to neurophysiology, we find that we are better able to adjudicate between these models. And in fact, neurophysiological evidence has furnished us with evidence in support of a collapsing bound model. There are many examples of this, particularly in the monkey neurophysiology literature. I'm just going to look at one example from Hanks, Kiani, and Shadlin in 2014. In which they trained monkeys to make perceptual judgments using motor responses in the form of eye movements. And they did this under both speeded conditions and conditions where accuracy was emphasized. And what you find is that there's an overall increase in the rate at which motor neurons trace the evolving decision under speed pressure. And in effect, this is akin to a growing urgency signal that more or less expedites the decision process, thereby requiring less information over time. And so mathematically, this is equivalent to implementing a collapsing bound. The focus of the research I'm going to present to you today is hopefully to be able to demonstrate to you that we've been able to identify a neural signature similar to this urgency component that has been identified in the monkey literature at the motor level, but in fact we've been able to identify, using EEG, a neural signature of urgency that is independent of motor preparation. And so in order to do this, we turned our attention to a signature, a neural signal that is already very well known in the EEG literature, which is called the contingent negative variation. And this is a negative going signal that was first identified by William Walter and his colleagues in 1964. And we locate this neural signal over the frontocentral regions of the scalp. The reason this signal is interesting in this regard is because it's been widely implicated in various aspects of temporal processing. So it's been implicated in temporal expectation, anticipation, and temporal preparation. More recently, however, in a study by Udo Bohm and colleagues, they found a direct correspondence between the CNV and decision-bound adjustments. So they, in their study, they had a speed accuracy trade-off manipulation, and they traced the CNV during the early time points in the task, so before sensory information was even presented to their participants in their study. They found that the CNV, which is a negative going signal, and here it's represented, the negative values are actually going in the positive direction, but under speed emphasis, they found that the CNV was more pronounced very early on. Not only did they observe this, but they were able to correlate the amplitude of the CNV in this early CNV directly with decision-bound estimates that were derived from through applying sequential sampling models. So this really cool finding suggests, points to the possibility that the CNV is indeed involved in urgency and involved in regulating our speeded responses. However, it does leave a number of outstanding questions. So although Bohm et al. Did manage to link the CNV, the early CNV, to decision-bound adjustments, they were actually measuring the CNV in a relatively early time window as opposed to measuring it at the time of decision commitment. And so what we hoped to do was to address some of the outstanding questions about the CNV and its link to urgency in perceptual decision making. So specifically, we wanted to see, does the CNV exhibit all of the key characteristics of an urgency signal? So is it sensitive to the speed accuracy manipulation, as has already been shown? Does it exhibit a time-dependent buildup that is characteristic of urgency? And is its buildup independent of sensory evidence? Then we also wanted to establish whether or not the CNV would represent urgency independent of motor preparation. So we've already seen from a lot of work in monkey neurophysiology that you can isolate urgency at the motor level, but we haven't yet seen if we can isolate CNV independent of motor preparation. So in my work, what we did was we ran a study using the dot motion discrimination paradigm. So in this task, participants will observe a cloud of moving dots, and after some period of time, a proportion of those dots will start to move coherently in one direction or another, and the task for them is to simply indicate whether the dots are moving to the right or to the left. We had 3 response regimes in this task. So the first was a high urgency condition in which the deadline for responding was 1200 milliseconds. We had a low urgency condition in which participants had to respond within 1800 milliseconds. And we also had a delayed response condition where they had to withhold their response until after the stimulus had gone away at 1800 milliseconds. What we found, as you would expect, is that under higher urgency, our participants were responding much faster compared to under low urgency. And also they tended to be less accurate under the higher level of urgency compared to lower urgency and the delayed response condition. But what we really wanted to see was, are we seeing any of these key markers of the collapsing bound effect? So we first looked at behavior, specifically looking at accuracy as a function of time. And we saw one of the key markers of the collapsing bound effect, which is a reduction in accuracy as a function of RT. Now, although this is associated with a collapsing bound, it's not exclusively diagnostic of a collapsing bound effect, and in fact could be accounted for by a variation in the rate at which participants are accumulating evidence, such that they accumulate evidence slower when they are responding slower. However, more convincingly, we've been able to show that when we measure this centroparietal signal, which again is our evidence accumulation signal that traces, that scales with sensory evidence strength, and which effectively represents the amount of evidence you've accumulated just prior to responding, we see that we have these hallmark characteristics of urgency. So first of all, overall, the CNV amplitude prior to response is lower under urgency, suggesting that under high urgency, suggesting that you've required less information, less sensory evidence in order to make your response. And also this, we see this collapse in the CNV amplitude as a function of RT, which is highly indicative and consistent with a collapsing bound. So then, turning our attention to the CNV in particular, we sought to examine those key characteristics and in order to determine whether or not this signal truly does reflect urgency. So just like Bohm et al., we found that under higher urgency, there was a more pronounced CNV during earlier time points in the task. So even before evidence had come on, we were seeing that the CNV was more pronounced under speed emphasis. When we then went and looked at the CNV as a function of RT just in the window prior to response, we found that the CNV in fact grows as a function of time. So again, this is very consistent with an urgency signal. Interestingly, we also found that the CNV accelerates over time, which we don't necessarily predict of an urgency signal, but it can speak to the shape of the urgency signal. In order then to dissociate the CNV from the decision process, we looked at whether the CNV was in any way reflective of sensory evidence accumulation. And in fact, we found something quite interesting in that the rate of accumulation or the rate of change in the CNV was actually steeper when you had weaker sensory evidence. So when the percentage of dots moving coherently in one direction or another was less. So this is the opposite of what you would expect of an evidence accumulating signal, but in fact can be attributed to this relationship between the CNV and time. So on harder trials, you would be responding slower, and consequently, we would expect to see that the CNV is growing more rapidly on those trials. To fully dissociate it from the evidence accumulation process, then we compared the CNV to the centroparietal positivity, which, as we normally expect, grew at a faster rate when sensory evidence was in fact stronger. And then finally, to speak to this question of whether the CNV indexes urgency independent of motor preparation, we compared the CNV under the low urgency condition and under the delayed response condition. And what we found here, which was really interesting, was that the CNV, even in the delayed response, actually resolves around about the same time that you're making your response under the low urgency conditions. So the CNV doesn't keep going until you are required to make your response. It seems to be more time locked to the decision process. So just to conclude on the key findings then, we found that the CNV, just as Bohm and colleagues had shown in 2014, is more pronounced at baseline under speed pressure. What was novel about our findings is that the CNV, in fact, also exhibits this time-dependent and evidence-independent growth. And moreover, the CNV does not seem to be tied to motor response execution. In fact, it seems to be more aligned with the time of decision commitment, which suggests that the CNV is representing something more of a cognitive urgency, where we usually associate urgency with the motor level. The CNV seems to be entirely dissociated from motor response execution. There are a number of outstanding questions and issues, some of which we hope to address and some of which are more long-term goals. So for instance, we will be looking to see if the CNV can be correlated with model-derived estimates of urgency. So at the moment, we're in the process of modeling this data using collapsing bound variants of the diffusion models. In order to see whether or not we can correlate the CNV with the estimates of the collapsing bound estimates from those models. We have done this so far with another data set, which shows very similar findings to what I've presented here. Interestingly, we're seeing that we do need urgency in order to account for behavior in these types of tasks. And without it, we're not getting very strong fits. So hopefully we'll have results with this specific data set very soon. It also leaves outstanding the issue of the underlying source of the CNV. So what exactly does the CNV represent? This entirely speculatively, we might suggest that it represents activity in the striatal pre-SMA pathway. This is something that was previously suggested by Bohm and colleagues, and which was based on some of the work by Birte Forsman and her colleagues. And interestingly, in a more recent study by Ciara and CSEC, they've been able to isolate a motor-independent and evidence-independent signature of urgency in the basal ganglia. So it's possible that those might that might provide the source for the CNV signal. As well as that, we're not entirely sure yet what the functional relationship between this cognitive urgency component is and sensory evidence accumulation and indeed motor preparation. So that's another question that remains to be addressed with some of our future research. And then finally, I just want to say thank you to my lab members, many of whom are co-authors on this paper. Also to thank the organizers for inviting me and giving me the opportunity, and to the reviewers who provided some incredibly helpful and richly detailed feedback on the paper. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you. We probably have time for one question. If the next speaker could come up and get ready while we're taking questions. So raise your hand and, okay, there we go.
Hi, over here. Thanks a lot for the talk. Is there any, do you find any relationship between these components and the threshold, the ID that the boundary decreases over time? Are these compatible IDs, or do you think it's a different mechanism that impacts evidence accumulation?
Yeah, so between the CNV and confidence?
Not confidence and the decrease in the boundary.
Yeah.
That is in all those papers. They say that this is the way you make faster decisions.
Yeah, so well, hopefully that's something we're going to be able to look at through modeling. So we intend on applying a collapsing bound variant of the fusion model, something we've already started to do. And ultimately, the goal would be to directly try and correlate the CNV as well as the centroparietal signal in order to see whether they're directly tracing the collapsing bound as it's estimated from our models. Yeah.
Okay, for the sake of time, we should move on to the next speaker. So thank you very much.